It started as just another quiet day in a small town where not much ever happened. The kind of place where people knew their neighbors by name, and the loudest sound you'd hear on a Sunday morning was the buzz of a lawn mower. The man who lived at the end of Willow Creek Road had owned his house for nearly 15 years. He wasn't the kind to make a fuss or draw attention. Most days he went to work, came home, fixed things around the house, and spent weekends tending to his garden. Behind his old wooden shed, though, there was something that always seemed a little out of place, a strange lump of dirt about the size of a small table. It wasn't big enough to seem important, but it wasn't natural either. The ground there looked slightly raised, as if someone had once dug something up or buried something there and never flattened it properly. The first time he noticed it, he thought maybe an animal had dug up the soil. It didn't seem worth worrying about. When he first moved into the house, the yard had been in rough shape. The shed leaned to one side, the fence was broken, and the grass grew tall around the edges. He spent the first few months fixing it all up. He painted the shed, trimmed the grass, and even built a small vegetable garden near the fence. Every time he walked by that strange patch of ground, he told himself he'd level it one day. But like many small chores, it never made it to the top of his list. Over the years, the lump became part of the scenery. When he mowed the lawn, he'd carefully go around it. When he raked leaves in the fall, he'd just pile them over that spot. Friends who came over sometimes joked about it. One neighbor even teased, "Maybe there's treasure buried there." He'd laugh and shrug. "If there is, it's staying there. I'm not digging up worms for nothing." The years passed quietly. The shed, which he used mostly for tools and old junk, stood steady through storms and seasons. Birds nested in its roof in the spring. Squirrels darted across its edges in the fall. The lump near it remained unchanged, just a small rise in the ground that seemed harmless and ordinary. But something about it always had a quiet presence, like it didn't belong yet didn't demand attention either. He remembered one summer afternoon when his nephew came to visit. The boy was about 10 years old and curious about everything. After running around the yard, he stopped near the shed and pointed. "What's that?" the boy asked, frowning at the lump. "Just a bit of old dirt," the man replied, not even looking up from his work. "You sure?" "It looks weird," the man laughed. "Everything looks weird when you're 10. That ended the conversation. Seasons came and went. Winters in that town were long and cold, the kind that left the ground frozen solid. The summers were warm and easy. Every year the man watched the same things happen: snow covering the shed, rain washing the soil, grass growing tall again. That spot never changed much. Sometimes when the soil was wet after a storm, it looked darker, almost as if the earth was holding something tight underneath. But he brushed off the thought as imagination. People who live in small towns often get used to the quiet. When nothing strange ever happens, you stop noticing small odd things. Life becomes a rhythm: work, home, rest, repeat. That was his life too. The lump behind his shed became as ordinary to him as the rust on his old tools or the cracks in his driveway. It was simply part of the background. Then came a period when heavy rains hit the area. It was one of those long, soaking weeks where the sky stayed gray and the air smelled of wet earth. The backyard turned muddy and puddles formed near the shed. For the first time, the raised patch of soil looked different. The rain had washed away part of it, leaving a small hollow at one edge. He noticed it one morning when he went out to check if the shed roof was leaking. Something shiny caught his eye, just a faint glimmer in the dirt. He crouched down and brushed away some wet soil with his hand. It looked like a small piece of metal, maybe old tin or a bit of rusted junk. He thought about grabbing a shovel but decided against it. The ground was soaked and he didn't feel like getting dirty. "I'll deal with it later," he muttered to himself, and as usual he didn't. But that day, for the first time in years, he found himself thinking about that patch more often. When he looked out the kitchen window, he could see it clearly. A small, uneven spot that seemed more noticeable now that part of it had eroded. Something about it tugged at his attention. He wondered if maybe the old owner of the house had buried a broken tool or some construction waste. He had never met the man who lived there before him. The real estate agent had simply said the house was sold after the previous owner moved away. As the days went by, he tried to ignore it again. He told himself it was nothing, just soil shifting after the rain. But once a thought like that enters your mind, it's hard to shake it off. He began to imagine all sorts of harmless explanations. Maybe it was a tree root, maybe an old pipe. Once, while watching a show about people finding old war relics buried in their yards, he even joked to himself, maybe I've got something valuable back there. The following weekend, he invited his neighbor over for coffee. They sat on the porch talking about the storm damage, and eventually, he mentioned the strange patch. The neighbor chuckled. That thing? I've seen it for years. Thought it was an old compost pile or something. If you dig it up, you might find gold, or more likely a pile of rusty cans. They both laughed, and that was that. But late that night, he couldn't sleep. The sound of rain tapping on the window returned, soft and steady. He got up, looked through the glass toward the shed, and for a moment, in the dim light of the porch bulb, the mound seemed larger than before. It cast a small shadow, darker than the rest of the ground. He told himself it was just the light playing tricks, yet something about it unsettled him. He closed the curtains and tried to go back to bed. Over the next few weeks, small things began to happen that drew his attention back to that spot again. The grass above it started to die off, leaving a rough patch of bare soil. One morning he noticed that the soil there had slightly sunk in, almost like the ground was slowly collapsing. Maybe a burrow, he thought, though no animals seemed to be around. One afternoon in early spring, while cleaning the shed, he found an old photograph tucked behind a stack of boxes. It showed the backyard years ago, maybe taken by the previous owner. The shed looked newer then, freshly painted, and there was something odd. The same lump of dirt was there in the exact same place, unchanged. That made him pause. If it had been there all those years ago, long before he moved in, then it wasn't just a random pile of soil. Someone had made it deliberately. He held the photo in his hand for a long moment, then slipped it back where he found it. He tried to laugh at himself for getting spooked over dirt. Still, he couldn't stop thinking about it. What kind of person would bury something in their backyard and leave it untouched for decades? And why had no one ever mentioned it when he bought the house? The thought stayed in his mind like an itch he couldn't scratch. Even when he tried to focus on other things, it returned. The lump behind the shed wasn't just part of the yard anymore. It had become a question that demanded an answer. He decided that when the ground dried up after the next rain, he'd finally dig it up and settle the mystery once and for all. That night, the sound of wind brushed softly through the trees, and the shed creaked gently in the darkness. The man sat inside by the window, sipping tea, staring out toward that faint rise in the soil. The same patch of earth he had ignored for 10 long years now seemed to stare back at him, silent and waiting. For a few days he couldn't stop thinking about the patch of ground behind the shed. It wasn't fear exactly, but a quiet curiosity that kept tugging at him. Every time he stepped outside, his eyes went to that spot. It was like something was waiting for him there, something that had been patient for years. The more he ignored it, the stronger the urge became to finally see what was beneath. One Saturday morning, after a long stretch of clear weather, he made up his mind. The ground had dried from the last rain and the sun was out, warm but not too hot. He put on his old work boots, found a shovel leaning by the shed, and walked toward the mound. For a moment he just stood there staring at it. It didn't look dangerous or important, just a small uneven bump of soil, but somehow it felt heavier than that. He took the first shovel of dirt and tossed it aside. The soil was loose and soft at the top, easy to move. The smell of fresh earth rose up, mixed with the faint scent of grass. After a few more shovels, he paused to wipe the sweat from his forehead. Nothing yet, just roots, rocks, and dirt. He told himself this was probably a waste of time, but his curiosity wouldn't let him stop. After digging a little deeper, the sound of the shovel changed. It made a dull, solid thunk, like metal hitting something harder. He froze for a moment. Then he dug around the area carefully until a small edge appeared beneath the soil. It was rusty, flat, and oddly shaped. He crouched down and brushed the dirt away with his hands. It looked like a piece of old metal, maybe part of a tool or a broken container. At first he didn't think much of it. Old houses often had junk buried in the yard, bits of fencing, tin, nails, or scrap metal from long ago repairs. But the shape of this thing didn't look like any junk he'd seen before. It was smooth along one edge with faded paint that looked almost like a color once, maybe blue or green. He tried to pull it up, but it didn't budge. It was stuck in the ground tight, so he widened the hole, digging carefully around it. As the dirt loosened, more of the metal showed, a larger piece than he expected. It wasn't just a random scrap. It looked like part of something bigger. The deeper he went, the more his heartbeat picked up. He still didn't know what it was, but the idea that it had been sitting under his shed all these years felt strange. He thought back to the photo he found in the shed, the one that showed the same mound decades ago. That meant whatever this was, it had been buried long before he ever came here. The sound of birds in the trees faded as he worked. The only noise was the scrape of his shovel and the occasional soft breeze brushing against the grass. A part of him wanted to stop to fill the hole and forget it, but another part, stronger and louder, told him to keep going. After nearly an hour, he had cleared away enough dirt to reveal a large, curved section of the object. It definitely wasn't random junk. It looked like a metal surface that had once been smooth, now rusted and rough. He tapped it with the handle of the shovel and heard a hollow echo. There was something empty beneath it. He sat back on his heels, breathing heavily, trying to think. Maybe it was an old storage tank or a piece of farming equipment, maybe even a septic cover. But it didn't look like any of those things. The shape seemed too deliberate, too structured. As he examined it, something caught his eye near the edge. A small piece of what looked like fabric, tangled in the soil. It was faded and fragile, maybe part of a tarp or cloth covering. He picked at it gently, but it tore apart like paper in his fingers. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked back at the exposed metal. A small part of him began to feel uneasy. The air around the shed felt heavier somehow, as if the quiet had thickened. Even the birds had stopped calling. He stood up, brushed the dirt off his hands, and looked around his yard. Everything looked normal. The trees swayed. The sun shone through the clouds. But something inside him told him he wasn't just digging up junk anymore. Still, he didn't want to jump to conclusions. People in small towns had a way of letting their imagination run wild. He told himself that it was probably just an old car part or leftover machinery. Maybe someone long ago had used the back of the yard as a dump site. That made sense, didn't it? He went back to digging. Slower this time, careful not to damage whatever was beneath. The soil grew denser as he went deeper, darker too. Every few inches, he stopped to look at what he was uncovering. The metal piece extended farther than he expected, forming a curve that dipped downward. It wasn't a flat object, it was rounded, maybe part of a larger structure. He tried to follow its edge, tracing it in the dirt, when he spotted something strange. A small rectangular plate bolted onto the surface. He brushed it off with his glove and leaned in close. There were faint markings on it, letters and numbers that were almost gone from rust. He couldn't read the full text, but one thing stood out clearly. It looked like the end of a license plate. His heart started to pound harder. He leaned back, staring at what he'd just found. A license plate? That meant this wasn't random metal. This was part of a vehicle, something buried deep in his yard. For a long minute, he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the ground as the realization sank in. A car. There was a car buried behind his shed. He tried to make sense of it. Why would someone bury a car? Maybe it was stolen and hidden. Maybe it was junked long ago and never removed. But the more he thought about it, the less sense it made. You don't bury a whole car in a backyard unless there's a reason. And usually it's not a good one. He felt a chill crawl up his arms, even though the day was warm. The thought that something had been under his shed for all these years made his stomach twist. He took a few steps back, breathing slowly. It was quiet again, almost too quiet. He considered stopping right there, maybe call the local waste department or a tow service to handle it. But then another thought crept in. What if there was something inside the car? Papers, old belongings, something that could explain who it belonged to or why it was here. He wasn't sure what he'd find, but the curiosity that had started as a small itch now felt like a pull he couldn't resist. He decided to uncover just a bit more, just enough to see what part of the vehicle it was. He dug along one side until he found the edge of what looked like a door panel. The handle was gone, but the shape was still there. His shovel scraped across something else, a piece of glass cracked but still partly intact. He brushed it off, revealing what looked like the remains of a window. It was definitely a car. He sat down on the ground, trying to calm his thoughts. It didn't make any sense. How could a car end up buried completely in a backyard? He had lived here for years and no one had ever said a thing about it. He thought about the previous owner again, the one who had moved away. Had he known about this? He decided that this was no longer something he should handle alone. It was too strange, too unsettling. He stood up, wiped his hands, and pulled out his phone. But before he made a call, he walked closer one last time to look at the hole. The dirt around it was dark and damp, and a faint smell of metal filled the air. He shivered slightly, though the breeze was warm. Then he turned, walked toward the house, and dialed for help. His voice was steady but low as he explained that he had found something unusual buried in his yard. An old car, maybe, and he wasn't sure what to do next. The operator asked him a few calm questions, then told him someone would come out to take a look. He thanked them, ended the call, and stood for a long moment on his porch staring at the backyard. The sunlight was fading, casting long shadows across the shed and the hole beside it. He felt both relief and unease. Relief that someone else would handle it now. Unease because he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just uncovered something that was never meant to be found. That night, as darkness settled over the quiet neighborhood, the yard looked peaceful again. But he couldn't stop glancing out the window, his mind replaying the image of that rusted metal and the faint numbers on that plate. For 10 years he had lived his life over that hidden secret, and now that it was uncovered, he knew his quiet days were about to change forever. The next morning, the man woke earlier than usual. The first thing he did was look out the back window. The ground near the shed looked the same as it had the night before, except for the pile of dirt beside the hole. The air was still, quiet and cool, but the sight of that uneven patch of earth made him uneasy. He tried to distract himself with breakfast, but every sound felt louder than usual. The scrape of his spoon, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock. He kept glancing toward the window. The shed stood there steady as ever, with the ground beside it now slightly sunken. It was hard to believe that under all that dirt, something big was waiting, something that had been hidden for years. Around mid-morning, a dark-colored SUV pulled up near his house. 2 people stepped out, one in a plain jacket and another in a dark blue uniform. They introduced themselves politely. He led them around the side of the house to the shed. The man explained how he had found the buried object, how he had first thought it was nothing, and how he realized it might be a car. The officers listened quietly, nodding. One of them took notes, occasionally glancing toward the backyard. When they saw the hole and the rusty metal peeking through, they both exchanged a quick look that made the man's stomach tighten. They asked a few questions. How long he'd lived there, whether he'd ever noticed anything unusual before, whether he knew the previous owner. He answered everything as best he could. After a moment, one of them said they would need to contact their department to bring in a small excavation team. He nodded in agreement. As they stepped away to make a call, he stood by the shed, feeling strangely disconnected from his own yard. For years, this place had been peaceful, his escape from the world. Now it felt different. The silence didn't feel calm anymore. It felt heavy, like the air was waiting. Within an hour, another vehicle arrived, followed by a small utility truck. A few more people stepped out carrying equipment. They laid out orange cones near the edge of the yard and began marking off a small perimeter. The man watched from a distance as they moved carefully, talking quietly among themselves. Neighbors started to notice. People walking their dogs slowed down near the fence. Someone from across the street peeked out their window. It was the kind of town where even a fire truck driving by would get everyone curious, so a team of officials standing in a backyard was enough to spark whispers. He didn't mind the attention. He was more focused on what was happening under the shed. The workers began to dig carefully, shoveling away layers of dirt. After a while, they brought in small tools, brushing and scraping instead of digging fast. The sun climbed higher, the heat rising off the ground, and the air smelled of fresh earth and rust. Bit by bit, more of the buried object appeared. The curved metal section widened into what was unmistakably a car roof. The dull blue paint was barely visible under the rust. The workers moved slowly, clearing the soil around the edges. The man stood nearby, not wanting to get in the way but unable to look away. He could hear short bits of conversation among the team, technical words, calm and careful. As the hours went by, the top half of the car became visible. The windows were broken, filled with dirt. The body was crushed in places, warped from the weight of the earth above it. It looked old, decades old. One of the officers checked something on a clipboard, then stepped aside to make a phone call. By early afternoon, more people had arrived, another car, then a van with official markings. A pair of specialists came out dressed in gloves and safety gear. They examined the vehicle closely, speaking in low voices. The man could tell from their tone that whatever this was, it wasn't going to be simple. He felt a strange mix of emotions: worry, curiosity, and disbelief. Part of him wanted to leave, to go inside and close the door, but another part of him couldn't step away. He felt responsible somehow, like he had disturbed something that was meant to stay buried. At one point, an officer approached him with a calm expression and thanked him for calling it in. They assured him he had done the right thing. The words were meant to comfort him, but they didn't. They only made him realize how serious this must be. As the digging continued, the car's outline became clearer. The trunk was exposed, dented but intact. The license plate was rusted, but parts of the numbers were still visible. One of the specialists crouched down with a small brush, cleaning it carefully. Another took photographs from different angles. The man stood silently, his hands in his pockets. He noticed how quiet everyone had become. The breeze had stopped, and the sound of the shovels seemed distant. For a long while, no one spoke. Then one of the workers called softly to the officer in charge. There was a short exchange, and the atmosphere shifted. He couldn't hear what they said, but the tone changed from routine to cautious. A few more people moved closer to the car. The man saw the officers exchange another look, one of concern, the kind that said they had found something more than they expected. He felt his throat tighten. He didn't want to imagine what it could be, but his mind filled with possibilities. It could be something harmless, maybe personal belongings, maybe evidence of an old theft. But the quiet seriousness on the faces around him said otherwise. After a few minutes, one of the officers walked over to him. The man straightened instinctively. The officer spoke gently, saying they might need to expand the area around the shed for a full investigation. It could take time. They asked if he could stay nearby for a few more hours in case they needed additional information. He nodded silently. He wasn't sure what else to say. They began setting up more equipment, lights, tape, and portable barriers. The once simple backyard now looked like a small construction site. The sound of radios crackled softly in the distance. A few officers took photographs from different angles. Others talked quietly into phones. As evening approached, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard. The orange glow made the rusted metal of the car shimmer faintly. The man stood near his back porch, arms folded, watching as the workers continued their careful work. Every so often, one of them would pause, whisper something to another, and continue. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life had changed in ways he didn't yet understand. For 10 years, he had lived peacefully here, never thinking twice about the soil beneath his feet. Now every part of this yard felt different, like it held a story he had never been told. As dusk settled, the yard filled with soft light from portable lamps. The officers had brought in a small generator to keep working as the daylight faded. They told the man they would probably finish for the night soon, but the site would remain secured until morning. He agreed, though he knew he wouldn't sleep much. The hum of the generator and the quiet murmur of voices continued until the stars came out. Then slowly the workers packed up their tools and covered the exposed area with a tarp. Before leaving, one of the officials approached him again. They told him that they would return in the morning to continue, and that he shouldn't go near the taped-off area. The tone was kind but serious. He nodded again, thanking them for letting him know. When the vehicles finally drove away, the yard fell silent once more. The man stood in the dim porch light, staring at the tarp covering the ground. The night air was cool, but his palms were damp. The sound of crickets filled the air, but it didn't bring peace. He walked slowly to the fence, looking out over the quiet neighborhood. The houses were dark, the street empty. It was hard to believe that just beneath his backyard lay something that had drawn officials, specialists, and flashing lights. When he finally went inside, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. Messages had come in from neighbors asking what was happening. He didn't know how to answer them. What could he say? That there was a car buried behind his shed and no one knew why. He turned off the lights, leaving only the soft glow from the window. Outside, the tarp fluttered slightly in the wind. He felt both small and overwhelmed, like he had stumbled onto a mystery far bigger than him. As he sat there, one thought kept returning: how something could stay hidden for so long right under everyone's noses. For 10 years, he had walked past that spot without a second thought. Now he couldn't look at it without wondering what else the ground might be holding. He finally stood up, closed the curtains, and whispered to himself, Tomorrow, maybe I'll understand. But deep down, he knew that whatever they found next would change everything. The next morning started quiet again, but the silence felt different now. He barely slept through the night, his thoughts circling around what might be buried under that tarp. When the first light crept through his window, he was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He looked outside and saw the taped-off area glinting faintly with dew. The shed stood behind it, calm and still, but he couldn't look at it the same way anymore. It felt like the whole place had changed overnight. His yard, which once brought him peace, now looked like the center of a secret he never asked to find. By mid-morning, the quiet was broken by the sound of car doors and footsteps. The team had returned. This time there were more of them, 2 trucks, a van, and several people carrying equipment. They greeted him politely, thanked him for his patience, and went straight to work. He stayed near the porch, watching as they carefully uncovered the tarp and resumed digging around the old car. They moved with purpose, taking photographs, recording details, measuring and marking things on clipboards. The sun climbed higher, and the air filled with the sound of shovels and quiet voices. Every now and then, someone from the team would step aside and make a call, speaking softly into their phone. The man couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could tell the discovery had reached more people than he expected. It wasn't just a small-town matter anymore. Around noon, one of the officers approached him and asked if he remembered anything unusual about the previous owner of the house or the property. He shook his head. When he'd bought the place, the owner was already gone, and the realtor had told him only that the man had moved away suddenly. At the time, he didn't think much of it. People moved all the time. Now it seemed important. The officer nodded thoughtfully, thanked him, and went back to the group. Soon after, they managed to expose more of the buried vehicle. The full shape was clear now, a small car, old, likely from decades ago. The color had faded almost completely, and the tires were flat and half gone. They were careful, almost delicate, as they continued clearing the dirt. The man watched, trying to read the expressions on their faces. Every so often, one of them would pause and exchange a quiet word with another. Whatever they were finding, it wasn't just a simple accident. He could feel tension in the air, though no one said anything directly. The tone of the workers' voices lowered, their movements slower, more deliberate. They used brushes and small tools, not shovels now. Cameras clicked softly. He stayed on the porch, clutching his coffee mug even though the drink had long since cooled. He told himself to stay calm, to let the professionals handle it. But inside, his thoughts wouldn't stop racing. Who had buried the car? Why? And how had no one noticed it for so long? After a while, one of the officers returned to him. This time their expression was serious but kind. They explained that they had found something that confirmed the car wasn't just discarded. It was connected to an old missing person case. The words hit him like a slow wave. He didn't know what to say. The officer reassured him again that he had done the right thing by calling, that none of this was his fault. Still, it didn't make the weight in his chest any lighter. They asked him to stay inside for a while as they finished their work. He agreed and stepped back into his house. From the window, he watched as more vehicles arrived, another unmarked car, then a van with official markings. The yard that once held only his garden tools now looked like something from a movie scene. He sat down at his table, staring at the floor. He thought about all the years he had spent living there peacefully, cutting grass, fixing the fence, watching the seasons change. All that time, something had been waiting just beneath the soil. Through the window, he saw officers setting up more lights and equipment. They were photographing everything carefully, measuring distances, collecting samples. Every move was calm and professional, but he could sense that this was big, something far beyond a local mystery. Later in the day, one of the officials came to speak with him again. They asked if he remembered when he first noticed the lump, if anyone else had ever mentioned it, or if there had been any digging in that area before. He explained everything, how he had seen it from the first week he moved in, how he always meant to flatten it but never did, how the rain recently had washed away some soil and exposed the metal. The officer listened closely, nodding and taking notes. When they finished, they thanked him again and said the investigation would continue for several days. They also mentioned that they would likely bring in records from the 1980s and 1990s to cross-check missing vehicle reports. That detail lingered in his mind. A car from that far back? It meant someone had gone missing long before he ever lived here. He thought of the photograph he found in the shed, the one showing the same mound unchanged even back then. The idea made him uneasy. As the sun began to lower, the workers carefully began to lift parts of the car's frame, using a small crane attached to one of the trucks. The ground shuddered slightly as the old metal creaked and shifted. The sound was deep, tired, almost mournful. He stood quietly on the porch watching. The team moved methodically, their faces focused. When the car finally came free of the earth, everyone paused for a moment. Even from where he stood, he could see that time had nearly erased its color and shine. Rust covered almost every inch, and vines had grown through parts of it underground. The man had to remind himself to breathe. The sight was haunting, not frightening, just deeply strange. This object, hidden for so long, had once been part of someone's life. Someone had driven it, washed it, filled it with memories. Now it was nothing more than a rusted shell being lifted from the dirt. The team covered the vehicle and prepared it for transport. They said it would be taken to a secure location for further examination. The man nodded silently, unsure what else to do. After they left, he walked to the edge of the hole. It was deeper than he thought, wide and uneven, with dark soil around the edges. He felt the urge to apologize, though he didn't know to whom. The ground looked empty, but it carried the weight of years, of secrets that had waited patiently to be discovered. Over the next few days, the investigators returned several times. They asked follow-up questions, took more photographs, and spoke to people in the neighborhood. Word had spread quickly. Neighbors came by with curious looks, asking what had happened, but he didn't have any answers. He simply said that an old car had been found and that the authorities were handling it. Inside his home, the quiet felt strange now. Every creak, every hum seemed louder. At night, he sometimes found himself standing by the window, looking out toward the shed. He couldn't stop thinking about the time he had spent there over the years, mowing the grass, storing tools, planting flowers nearby. All those peaceful moments had happened only a few feet away from something that carried a story no one had told. One evening, an officer stopped by again, this time to thank him personally for his cooperation. They said the case had indeed connected to an old disappearance that had puzzled investigators for decades. Details were still being confirmed, but the discovery had already brought important answers. The man nodded, unsure how to feel. Part of him was relieved that something good might come from this, that families could finally have closure. But another part of him felt the quiet sorrow of realizing that his home had been sitting above someone else's tragedy for so long. After the officer left, he sat outside for a long time, the air cool and still. The hole in his yard had been filled in and leveled, though the ground was darker there, the soil freshly turned. The shed looked the same as always, but it no longer felt like just a place for tools and storage. It felt like a reminder of how easily the past can hide beneath the surface, waiting to be seen. That night, as he watched the stars appear, he felt something shift inside him. The fear had faded, replaced by reflection. He realized that for years he had ignored small things, the uneven ground, the little signs, because life had been comfortable. But now he understood that even the quietest places can hold stories we don't expect. In the days that followed, he began to spend more time outside again. He cleaned the shed, trimmed the grass, and repaired the small fence near the back. The patch of ground where the car had been buried looked different now, flat and calm. Yet every time he passed it, he felt a quiet respect for what it had held and for how much it had changed his understanding of this place he called home. He didn't look for more mysteries after that. Some things, he decided, were meant to rest once they'd been uncovered, but he never forgot the feeling of standing there, shovel in hand, realizing that beneath the soil he'd walked over for 10 years lay a story that had been waiting to return to the world.